Go. I know, thank you. All right, so it is basically at the place to where it is a dark time in the history of Israel, and we've seen some crazy stories. Like so far, whether online or here in the house, what is it that we've gone through in the first 18 chapters of Judges that maybe you've read it before, or you've heard about it, you've been taught it or whatever, and you were reminded again, or even if it's like you've remembered, you go, that's just crazy. What are some things that caught you either off guard or just running through? Yes, sir.
Israel always would repeat the cycle. Whenever a judge would come, they would fall. So when a judge dies, they have to do not the word and all that.
It's this, thank you. It's this cycle that's over and over again. And you scratch your head and you go, what is wrong with these people? And then we're reminded it's not a whole lot different than sometimes us, right? To where we go through those own cycles of that Israel went through. What else? Anybody else?
The judge, like Samson, was not such a good guy.
Yeah, even the judges themselves were not necessarily that great of a person. When you read their story, right, and what they did, and it's like, wow. And here's a guy that's like Samson, that's in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews, right? And it's like, wow, okay. What else? Yes, ma'am.
I think it explains a great deal of why there's so many problems. Is that God told them to go in and take the land, remove the idol worshipers and the evil that is there, and they chose not to. And it has over and over and over again come back to bite them really hard, and to the point that by the time that you get to Samson, it's just a way of life. They have just turned themselves over to the idolatry and being intermixed with the Philistines and the others, and it's really sad.
Yeah, I think it is sad, right? Because they wouldn't have had all of these problems if they had just simply been obedient, right? So they went into the promised land, and God gave them very specific instructions that when they went into occupy, that they were to utterly destroy those people. It's not that God is evil. It's because God is good, and he knew he had given them hundreds of years, the people there, to repent. And they just got more and more wicked. So God knew, but they didn't. And all these problems that we're reading at, and how far Israel had gone downhill during this period of time. Anybody online? Anybody unmute yourself if you want to share anything on this? Just like as you've been reading through, it's like, wow, that's just a crazy story, or I had no idea.
It's not that I had no idea. It's just God's continuous grace.
Yes, in spite of them, right?
Yes.
In spite of of all the issues and stuff, and he's fulfilling his promise. In fact, we all know that God, of course, is still not done with Israel. There's still a plan for them, but right now we're in this age of the church. But after the rapture of the church, God will be turning back to Israel. And so he's not done with them yet. So many different stories. Well, the reason I opened up with that is because you ain't heard nothing yet. These last few chapters, you're like, this is just bizarre. It's just crazy. And it shows how deep sin can affect an individual and a group of people, to the place to where it's just where people start acting weird and bizarre, and it's just evil and so forth. So hopefully you have your handout there for lesson 10. And as we fill in the blank along the way, we're at the latter part now. We're in part 3, the epilogue, which is the dereliction of Israel, which is chapter 17, all the way through the end of the book. And last week, we looked at both chapter 17 and 18. This evening, we're going to continue on. But before we do that, let me do a little further introduction, again, to set context. We have, in the last story in Judges, last week, it's bringing us to this culmination, if you will, of horrible conditions that prevailed in Israel right before the rise of the monarchy, which is going to be eventually, there will eventually be a king that will be established. But chaos and lawlessness and anarchy prevailed during this particular time. Now, when I say the word anarchy, what comes to mind? And not a Netflix show. Yes.
Just chaos, no.
Yeah, it's chaos, no order. What else? When I say the word anarchy.
Oregon, Washington, DC.
Oh, yeah, Oregon, Washington, Minneapolis, all these different type things. Okay. So there's a level, it's just pure lawlessness, right? It is anarchy. And over again, we've seen in Judges to where it says there's no king in the land, and the people did which was right in their own eyes. We would like to think that if we did what we thought was right, that it would be right. But has it ever crossed your mind that if we didn't have this to guide and direct us, and we just did what we thought in our own eyes was the right thing, where would we be? Let's start right here in our home. It would be chaos. It would be a mess. And then you take that outside of your home and you go into a community, then you go into a state, and then you go into a nation, and then you keep going. If that were the case, if we had a place in our current culture right now, which some people do, they do what's right in their own eyes. Of course, if you don't know the Lord, that's exactly what you're doing. And so this is where they had land. And so we're gonna see how far the nation had fallen during this period of time. Now, keep in mind, the book of Judges covers around 350 to 400 years-ish. And these last chapters are not in chronological order. They're kind of more of an appendix, especially appendix? Is that the word I want to use? Yeah, for some reason I'm thinking about your appendix. But anyway, so yeah, it's the appendix of things that kind of gives us a further story. In fact, it's kind of spread out earlier, like last week, what we looked at, those chapters 17 and 18 were dealing with the period of time just right after Joshua had died. And this is not all that far from that. It's somewhere in there. We don't know exactly, but we know that it's not chronological. And so they fell away morally from the Lord in his standard of righteousness. Now we notice, as I just said, that in the last 5 chapters, we're not chronological. And these last 5 chapters are this appendix or addendum to the book to describe what happens whenever God's people fall away from him. So for sake of outline, and we'll see if I can get through all of this tonight, in your fill in the blank is the crime of Gibeah and war against Benjamin. That's going to take us from chapter 19, where we're going to start tonight, all the way through the end of the book. Specifically, in number 1 on your fill in the blank, it is the atrocity against the concubine of the Levite. This story that we're going to read in chapter 19, as a matter of fact, it bleeds into 20 and 21, is dealing with this situation and this concubine of this Levite. Now, this Levite is not to be confused with the Levite that we saw earlier. It's a totally different guy, even though he's kind of still from the same general vicinity. The other Levite, if you remember, that we learned about earlier, that was like, remember, like he had his own personal Levite. He moved up to the northern section. This one is not the same one, but he's a Levite. Now, folks, what is a Levite? Come on, Bible scholars. What's a Levite? He's a priest, right? It's part of the priesthood family. It comes out of the Aaron line, the Aaronic line. And they were, and of course they had clans and so forth that were part of the Levitical line and family and so forth. So anybody that served or was a Levite, someone that was part of that tribe, if you will, was part of the priestly tribe. And keep in mind, they had they had everything that they needed concerning what they would be as a Levite, because prior to that, they had the writings of who told them everything that what a Levite's supposed to do. Who was the writings of? Moses, right? So Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, specifically in Leviticus, because I know you guys know this, but just in case you don't, so it's not Leviticus, but it is Leviticus. What is the first few letters in their spell? Levi, right? So it's the book of Leviticus is dealing with the Levitical order, right? That's why you have all these things in the priesthood. You see it in Numbers also, you even see some of it in Deuteronomy. So we see this atrocity that this person who is a priest that should know all of the law that God had given them, we're going to see some stuff that's like, it's just heartbreaking to see how the level had gotten. So in verses 1 through 9, we are going to see the reconciliation of the Levite with his concubine. Now, before I go any further, what is a concubine? No, it's not a harlot. I'm sorry? It's another woman, but to also be more specific. What's a concubine?
Another woman has a baby with that man.
Yeah. So in other words, someone that's like had a
Like Abraham.
sexual relations. It's so with it, but they're not their legal wife.
Right.
All right. Because so, for example, if you remember that Abraham, right? But let's go to Solomon. Solomon had how many wives?
500.
700.
700. Yeah.
700 wives. That's just like going downtown and go, you and you and you and you for years, right? You're going to be my wife. But he also, the Bible tells us, had concubines, which is just basically another woman with fringe benefits. That's really what it was. And so the reality is that a Levite, of all people, God was very, very clear, is not to have a concubine. In fact, it was never God's plan for polygamy anyway. He allowed it in his grace, but his plan has always been what? One man, one woman for 30 years. No, for life, right? Forever. All right. And so no concubines, none of that other stuff. So I'm sharing that because we need to understand that right in itself should give us a little bit of an indication of the issue here. All right. So let's look here in verse 9. All right. Chapter 19, verse 1 through 9. In those days, somewhere in this 350 to 400 year period of the time of the judges, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, again, keep in mind, Bethlehem at this particular point of time is not the capital, if you will, of Israel. It will eventually become that, but not yet. And his concubine was what? Unfaithful to him. And she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there for 4 months, for some 4 months. Then her husband, this Levite, arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. I always get tickled why the word of God always just seems to give us these little details. Something about donkeys and all that thing. And, he had a servant and a couple of donkeys. And she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. Now, this drinking is not like just eating and drinking. It's like they're having, hey man, come on, have a beer with me. All right. They're drinking and they're having a good time. And on the 4th day, they arose early in the morning and he prepared to go, but let's watch what happens. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, the Levite, strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go. So the two of them sat and ate and what? Drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, be pleased to spend the night and let your heart be merry. And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day, he arose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, behold, now the day has waned toward evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry. Let's drink some more. And tomorrow you shall rise early in the morning for your journey and go home. So the narrative itself here really kind of gives us a pretty good idea. But let me build on these little things. If we're not careful, we'll miss these things. So as I've already shared, first of all, about the concubine thing, this Levi should have never have done that. And so he had this concubine, and what did she do? All right, so she cheated, right? Here's a guy that's taking care of her. And so she cheated, and for whatever reason, maybe she was fearful that something would happen to her or whatever, what does she do? She goes to her father's house, all right? So had an affair, and then rather than face her husband, she runs off to her father's home back in Bethlehem, staying there for how long? For 4 months. Yeah, for some 4 months, right? Whatever that means. Yeah, some ish. I guess that's the way to say ish. So when this Levite arrives at his father-in-law's house, and the reason it's saying father-in-law, because it's not a concubine is considered like a wife-ish. There are some legal type things, but a concubine would not have all of the other things, if you will, that a proper wife would have. Go figure, right? So his father-in-law was glad to see him. Now, does anybody have any indication on possibly, other than having a drinking buddy, why he would be happy to see him?
Because seems to be coming after her to take her. Well, apparently doesn't want them to leave, but she's yours, take care of her.
Okay, so possibly, in other words, look, man, this is my daughter. She should have been out of here a long time ago. I'm glad to see you. She needs to be out of here. Possibly. Why else do you think? And that's not necessarily wrong. It's a strong possibility. Here's the culture. The culture is such that it is a disgrace for something like that to happen. In that culture, to give your daughter away and blessings and all of those different type things, to have them come back. And I feel pretty confident that he probably knew or found out what happened. So he's ashamed. He's embarrassed. And then so he sees the son-in-law now come to get her, welcomes him in, and let's just have a drinking party. All right. And it's bizarre because he's there for 3 days and the guy keeps pressing him to stay. And the word of God doesn't really give us enough detail as to why he would doing that. But again, it's probably just a result of he's trying to get this favor of possibly this guy back. and he's got a drinking party or a partner now. Who knows? But he keeps pressing him, and at some point, the Levite's going to go, I got to go, man. I got to go, which is exactly what's getting ready to take place now. He wants him to party for one more day. And then so we see in verses 10 through 15, the arrival of the Levites' entourage at Gibeah. So let's look here in these verses 10 through 15. But the man is the Levite, would not spend the night. He rose up and he departed and arrived opposite Jebus, which is an original name for Jerusalem. And he had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And his master said to him, we will not turn aside into the city of foreigners, all right, because they were Jebusites. Was a Jebusite part of Israel. How many here say yes? How many here say no? How many here say, I don't know? How many of you say, I don't care? Right? So, in other words, they were not. All right. So he's thinking, they're not family. I'm not going to go over there. Now, of course, if they had taken care of his earlier of destroying all those people, they wouldn't have to worry about the Jebusites being there. But so in verse 12 again, his master said to him, we will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. Now, Gibeah is in the area to where Benjamin was. Is Benjamin an Israelite?
Yes.
Yes, that's one of the tribes. All right, the youngest son of Jacob. And he said to his young man, come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah, which is again another area there where the Benjamites would be. So they passed on and they went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, and they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and he sat down in the open square of the city. Notice here, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. Now, we look at that and we go, well, I probably wouldn't either, man. I don't know this clown and his donkeys and his chick, right? And his, that was not the culture. In fact, first of all, especially in the culture, but especially if you were part of Israel, the whole idea of hospitality is huge in that culture, huge. So that in itself gives us a little bit of an indication of how depraved these people were beginning to get also. In other words, the typical culture of hospitality was beginning to go away. So we see when this father-in-law wanted this Levite to stay for the 5th day, he heads out, and this servant wants to go to a place closer. He says, I'm not going to do that. So they get there, and there's no place for them to stay. Nobody wants them. So if you'll notice there, it says they were in the open square of the city. So they're out there in the open, and it's very, very public, obviously, right? So in verses 16 through 21, we see the hospitality of this old man from Ephraim, the hospitality of an old man from Ephraim. Look here in verses 16 through 21. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. So in other words, he was from actually a same area to where this Levite was from. He's passing through, and the men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, where are you going? And where do you come from? And he said to him, we are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one is taking me into his house. We have, now, you notice here he says, we're going to the house of the Lord. All right. So it's like, oh, yeah, he's got it together. He's strong in his faith and so forth. And he says, in other words, we have straw and feed for our donkeys with bread and wine for me and your female servant and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. In other words, it's not like that the place to where, you're coming hungry and I'm going to now have to feed you and so forth. He had everything. And the indication is he would have gone around asking for a place to stay, and nobody was letting him. And it wasn't because he didn't have supplies. He had supplies. Verse 20. And the old man said, peace to you, I will care for your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet, and they ate and they drank. So you're going, wow, okay, this old man, nice guy, hospitable, washes his feet, is not going to allow him to live out there. And you're thinking, great, hospitable, probably a very, very godly man. He's an Israelite himself, and is hospitable. But then, notice what happens. Letter D, the assault of the wicked men of Gibeah, we see in verses 22 through 26. This is crazy. And as they were, what do you notice there? They're making their hearts merry, man. The dude he's a drunk, right? And so they're drinking, they're having all this stuff, they're making their hearts merry. Behold, the men of the city, and here we see that term again. What are they? They are worthless fellows. Surrounded the house. Now, this is going to be very familiar. It's going to sound like, wait a minute, that sounds very familiar to another story in the Bible. Surround the house, beating on the door, and they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him. Now, that is not like, I just want to see his ID and kind of get to know him. That is knowledge in the carnal sense from the aspect of sexual relations is what they're saying. So here's this Levite that shows up in town. They hear about it. They go to the old man's house and says, why don't you need to deliver him over to us so that we may know him. Verse 23, and the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my what? My brothers, dude, what's your problem? Do not act so wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Now, would what they're thinking, would that be vile? Yes, right? Would we all agree? With what they're planning on doing would be vile. And the old man says, don't do this vile thing. But notice what he does next. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. What in the world? Now, first of all, here's the thing. I don't want to camp here too long, but I think we all know this, but I want to drive home the fact. In the pagan culture, the women were seen lower than even the animals. Okay. But God's culture elevates the woman. He still has a role for them, but she is elevated. In fact, they would have known that through the writing of Moses and God's plans and purposes for them. These are Israelites. These are Benjamites that come and they want to have homosexual relations with this guy. And he goes, oh man, that's wicked. That's vile. I've got my virgin daughter and have got his concubine. Do with them. In fact, you notice here, what's the word that he uses? He says, violate them and do with them whatever you want. But whatever you do not do anything that's outrageous thing to this man. But verse 25, but the men would not listen to him. So in other words, they're just like, no, we still want you, want him. But the old man grabs the concubine of the Levite and made her go out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. Now, what's running through your mind right now? What are some thoughts? Okay, right. In other words, how come the Levite didn't say, no, dude, you are not taking my concubine, right? What is wrong with you? You're not going to take my concubine. I think somebody online is trying to say something.
He also didn't put his daughter out there.
Yeah, he knows right. He didn't put his own daughter out there. He goes, I don't know, it's concubine. Let me go ahead and let her out. Now, is it possible that the Levite maybe had shared that she cheated on me? It's possible. We don't know. All right. But it's just ironic that he thinks all this other stuff is vile, but he has no problem offering his own daughter and or the concubine for these guys. And they violate her, they rape her, they gangbang her all night long. These are Benjamites. These are children of Israel. This Levite clearly is not having a problem with it. Yeah, all right, kind of let her go. So we've seen this assault by these wicked men. And now we see in letter E, the call of the Levite for tribal vengeance. The call of the Levite for tribal vengeance. Now, when I read this over and over again, and as I study throughout the week, and I look at all these commentaries and stuff like that, it's like it's so bizarre, because again, he seemed to have no trouble with any of this happening. She comes to the steps after she had been violated all night, and now let's look here in verses 27 through 30 as we go to that. It says, so and her master, this is the Levite, rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house and with her hands on the threshold. In other words, the indication is there, it's possible he figured she's gone now, I'm just going to go on about my way. All right. He opens up the door and there she is laying there at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. Notice here what he says to her. Get up. All right, let's be going, right? She had been violated all night, clearly beaten. It gives us an indication of the level of this guy, but there was no answer. All right, so he's figured she's either dead or she's getting ready to die. Verse 28. He says, but there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. This is the Levite now, thrown her on the donkey. We don't know if this point she's dead or not. We don't know. Verse 29. And when he entered his house, notice what he does. He takes a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, what does he do? He divides her, limb by limb, into 12 pieces. Why do you think 12? All right, he's getting ready to send her parts to all the tribes. Let's keep reading. And sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. Chapter 19 ends with this. It's like, that is just so bizarre. Now, fast forward, eventually we see in the story of who was Israel's first king? Saul. Saul does something similar, but he takes an animal, all right, to make a point. He takes an animal, divides it up into 12 pieces, and sends it out with a message. Now, the implication is that he didn't just send her body pieces to all over the different places. We don't know how they got there. They did not have FedEx then, all right? They didn't have Amazon. Maybe he used his, I'm sorry? Maybe a raven, or, somehow it could have been his servant or whatever, but somehow he sent these parts all over. And the implication is that there would have been some type of note that went with this. And they get these, the leaders of these tribes going, never have we ever seen anything like this. This is vile. This is terrible. Well, now we go into chapter 20, and the next part on your outline is the war against the tribe of Benjamin. Now, there's just came out of the Benjamite territory, and there's going to be war against them. Well, in verses 1 through 11, letter A there, we see the assembly of Israel at Mizpah. Let's read here the narrative. Verse 20, chapter 20. Then all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba. Now, just a little thing, Bible scholars. Whenever you see that term, from Dan to Beersheba, that's just a way of basically going from the one furthest reach area of Israel to the other end. To us, it would be like from New York to what? To LA. Or from Minnesota down to New Mexico or whatever, right? It is the furthest. So whenever you see that term from Dan to Beersheba, and it's all throughout the Old Testament, and there's even some places in the New Testament, it just means an indication it's the whole countryside, right? So from the north to the south in this case. And it says, including the land of Gilead, and the congregation assembled, what did you notice there? As one man. This is the first indication and only indication in all of Judges that the nation basically is united. They're getting united in this particular instance. At Mizpah, and the chiefs of all the people, of all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. Now notice here, in verse 3, it says, now the people of Benjamin heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the people of Israel said, tell us, how did this evil happen? And the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin. In other words, I was in their territory, I and my concubine, to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me, excuse me, and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me. Well, they meant to do more than that, dude. And they violated my concubine, and she is dead. Stop there just a moment. Well, it's true, but why? He let it happen. And it's ironic here, so all of a sudden he's stirring up all this problem that, hey, listen, somebody's going to pay for this. He could care less. All right. And it says, I and my concubine to spend the night, and the leaders of Gibeah. So, verse 6, I took hold of my concubine and cut her in pieces. My. And sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Well, yeah, of course they did, but you didn't do any better, dude. Behold, you people of Israel, all of you, give your advice and counsel here. So in other words, basically he's going, so what are we going to do about this? Let's go on through verse 11. And all the people arose, what do you notice again, as what? As one man. They're united here. It's like, oh yeah, we got a cause here, saying, none of us will go to his tent, and none of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. In other words, they'll kind of determine who's going to go by lot. And we will take 10 men of 100,000, or of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, to bring provisions for the people, that when they came, that they may repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the outrage that they have committed to Israel. So all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united what? As one man. So let me give a little bit further things for context, because as we read on, you'll understand kind of some things that what they're saying here. So the Levite tells these 400,000 men from Israel how the men of Gibeah ravished his concubine all night long, that results in her death. However, if he were honest, he would have admitted that he was also responsible for her death. He didn't even give up a fight. So these 400,000 men of Israel commit themselves to coming against the tribe, excuse me, I'm sorry, of Benjamin. Sorry, Mr. Thomas, I'm probably coughing in your head there. And they came up with a plan for supplying their troops for the battle. We'll see later, as we continue on here in the next chapter, that the men of Israel on this day actually make 3 vows pertaining to the tribe of Benjamin, at least 2 of which they're eventually going to regret that they made. Number 1, they will not go home until Gibeah is attacked and destroyed. We just saw that. We're not going to go home till this is taken care of. Number 2, anyone who does not come together with them to battle against Gibeah will also be destroyed. And number 3, this is an important one to remember, they will not allow their daughters to marry the sons of the tribe of Benjamin. So in other words, we're going to keep this all within Israel, but not Benjamin. You cannot take. So they made this vow. Keep that in the back of your mind. Notice now in verses 12 and 13, the rejection of the verdict by the Benjamites. Let's look here. And the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribes of Benjamin, saying, what evil is this that has taken place among you? Now, therefore, give up the men, the what? The worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. And notice they're probably remembering the story of Achan, remember? In Ai, when they were going to destroy Ai, if there's sin in the camp, God's not going to bless us. Of course, they're so far gone anyway, but they're trying to do the right thing here. And they want to purge this evil from Israel, but the Benjamites would not do what? They would not listen to them, to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. Then the people of Benjamin came together out of the cities to Gibeah to go out to battle against the people of Israel. And the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day, how many men? Compared to what? All right. Who drew the sword beside the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. Among all these were 700 chosen men who were what? All right, there's your lefties. My wife's lefty. All lefties, raise your hand. All right, got a few. All right, my wife. You're lefty, Lori? Yes. All right, got a few of you guys in here. All right, and we've seen that before. We've seen this mention of this left-handedness in battle, and it says everyone could do what? They could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. In other words, they're very, very accurate. And the men of Israel, have I gone too far? I think I have. So they reject. So now in verses 14 through 18, when I'm reading letter C, on there is the mustering of the troops for battle. That's where we are right here in verse 14 through 18. And so, and the men of Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 men who drew the sword, and these were men of war. Now, so, and look at verse 18, the people of Israel arose and they went up to Bethel and did what? They inquired of God. Now, first of all, are they supposed to be in Bethel?
No.
No. Where is the place to where they should be inquiring, where all the Levites should be, where the Ark of the Covenant should be? Where should it be? Shiloh. You guys remembered that, right? So first of all, again, another indication it wasn't where it was supposed to be. And they inquired of God. And you'll notice in quotes, here's their question: who shall go up first for us to fight against the people of Benjamin? And notice here, and the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. So they're thinking, got our answer. They went to the things. We don't know how they did it. If they used the Urim and the Thummim, somehow God communicated to them, which was his plan anyway, was for them to always get counsel from him through the Levites and the leaders and so forth. So they asked him, so, hey, all right, so who shall go first? Now keep this in mind, because if we're not careful, we'll miss these little nuances on where they're messing up here. So first of all, we have this huge amount of men of all the other tribes, and we have the Benjamites, and of their 26,700 of them are really good with a slingshot. They're left-handed, very, very accurate. So you would think just on the surface, they're probably going to win anyway, but they go to God. And you think, oh, yeah, okay. They inquired of God. Well, we go on. Interesting. The men of Israel are going in the right direction by coming before the Lord about going up in war against the tribe of Benjamin. However, here's the nuance that we're not. They don't realize that they cannot have God's blessing, first of all, with the sin that is presently even in their own lives. So they're missing that part. Secondly, they're presumptive concerning the Lord. They're not asking the right question. What should the question be? Okay, that would be certainly a good question. Are you going to be with us? But I want to take it back even further than that. What did they ask? Who shall go first? What's missing? Should we even go?
Should we even do it?
Right. In other words, they're just they're presumptuous on God. All right, hey, we're going. And so we're going to go to you, God, and we're going to ask who should go first. They didn't even inquire of him whether they should even go in the first place. Then we see in verses 19 through 28, letter D, the victories of Benjamin over Israel. 400,000 compared to 26,000, and of those 700 with these other guys. So let's look here in verses 19 through 28. Then the people of Israel rose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. Again, that's the Benjamite territory. And the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin. And the men of Israel drew up the battle line against them at Gibeah. And the people of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed on that day, how many? 22,000 men of Israelites. But the people, the men of Israel, took courage, and they again formed the battle line in the same place that they had formed it on the first day. And the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until the evening. Why? Because they lost. And you're probably wondering, you told us what to do. And they inquired of the Lord, shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? You notice here now that the language is changing a little bit. Do you want us to go fight our brothers here? For the first time, they're mentioning their own brothers. And the Lord said what? Go up against them. All right, we've got the Lord with us. So you would think if we were to stop the narrative right there, what's going to happen? Well, you know the answer here. Verse 24. So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day, And Benjamin went out against them out at Gibeah the second day and destroyed what? 18,000 men of the people of Israel. And all these were men who drew the sword. In other words, these are battle people, right? Soldiers. Then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and did what? And they're wept. They're thinking, what in the world is going on? And they sat there before the Lord. And for the first time, we see there now, they are fasting that day until evening, and they offer burnt offerings. Should they have done that in the first place? Yes. And peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, who is the son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. The dynamics now has changed. The dynamics have changed to where they have a contrite heart. They have fasted. They have wept. They had offered. They're seeking the Lord's face. They're starting to ask the right question. Now, in verses 29 through 46, we see the defeat of the Benjamites by Israel. And if you will bear with me, the narrative itself, not a lot of notes here. This just kind of gives us an indication of where we're going to go. And I am thankful because I think we're going to be able to get through chapter 21. It says, starting in verse 29, so Israel set men in ambush around Gibeah. Now they're using a tactic that we're getting ready to see, which is very similar to what they did at Ai. And the people of Israel went up against the people of Benjamin on the third day and set themselves in array against Gibeah as at other times. And the people of Benjamin went out against the people that were drawn away from the city. Remember that's in when we studied Joshua, and they drew them out. They had people in ambush. And as at other times, they began to strike and kill some of the people in the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel and the other to Gibeah, and in the open country, about 30 men of Israel. And the people of Benjamin said, they are routed before us as at the first. But the people of Israel said, let us flee and draw them away from the city to the highways. And all the men of Israel rose up out of their place and set themselves in array at Baal Tamar. And the men of Israel who were in ambush rushed out of their place from Gibeah, and there came out against Gibeah 10,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and the battle was hard, but the Benjamites did not know the disaster was close upon them. So now it's changing up here a little bit as we continue on. It says, and the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the people of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day. And these were men who drew the sword. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin because they trusted the men in ambush who they had set against Gibeah. So you're thinking this, you're seeing this strategy now. Come on. They trusted them. They knew they would draw them out. They knew they were going to do that. Then verse 37, then the men in ambush hurried and rushed out against Gibeah. The men in ambush moved out and struck all the city with the edge of the sword because they had pulled them out. All right. Now the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men in the main ambush was that they made a great cloud of smoke rise up out of the city. So they're distracting them, thinking, oh, well, no, something's on fire. We better go take care of this. The men of Israel should turn in battle. Now Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. And they said, surely they are defeated before us, as in the first battle. But when the signal began to rise out of the city in a column of smoke, the Benjamites looked behind them, and behold, the whole of the city went up in smoke to heaven. And then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were dismayed, for they saw the disaster was close upon them. Therefore, verse 42, they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness, but the battle overtook them. And those who came out of the cities were destroying them in their midst. Again, forgive me, you guys can read all this yourself, but it keeps us together here. Verse 43, surrounding the Benjamites, they pursued them and trod them down before Nohah, as far as opposite Gibeah on the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, and all of them were men of valor. So they're getting gobbled up here now, as far as their population. And they turned and they fled towards the wilderness of the rock of Rimmon, because this is one tribe again, just remember. 5,000 men of them were cut down in the highways, and they were pursued hard to get them. And 2,000 men of them were struck down. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of them men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled towards the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon and remained at that rock of Rimmon 4 months. In other words, they dwindled down to just a handful. And the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men of beasts, and all that they found, and all the towns that they found were set on fire. Now, when you're reading this and we're reading this narrative and we're seeing here what's happening, what are some problems here that are going on, first of all? In other words, what's running through your head?
He was sending out the guys that wanted the group of guys that surrounded the house.
Okay, so they could have just done that, found the guys, did some CIA or FBI work, find out how they were and destroyed them.
Just send them out. We
Yeah.
just want the guys that were gonna do this.
Oh, they could have done that. Benjamin could have done that, yes.
They could have done that, would have been fine, but, so, is that like insinuating or saying that not just the guys that surrounded the house would have liked to?
I don't know, that's a good question, right? And so that's sort of, I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. In other words, that could in itself.
They're saying, oh, well, that's okay. There's nothing wrong.
Yeah, possibly they were thinking, it's like, what's the big deal? The thing that runs through my mind is that they're all family. And they are destroying a whole tribe of the nation of Israel. A whole tribe.
Where they wouldn't obey God and destroy the foreigners, all the ites at the beginning, that here all of a sudden now they're raising up against their own families.
Yeah, yeah. And it's sad. So I left out the next thing in verse 47, 48 is the aftermath of the defeat of Benjamin in letter F there. So as we go into chapter 21, they begin to realize, what have we done? All right, what have we done? Now, I gave you 3 vows that they said or 3 vows that they took. Who remembers what they were? They will not go home.
Their daughters will marry any sons of Benjamin.
Yeah, the daughters will not be allowed to marry any of the sons of Benjamin, and they'll destroy anybody that decides they don't want to come out and help us. That was that, okay? Keep the one about the daughters in mind. Chapter 21. Letter number 3 on your outline is the preservation of the tribe of Benjamin. Well, hello. In verses 1 through 24, specifically in verses 1 through 7, the national concern for the completeness of Israel we see now in these first 7 verses. Now, the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, no one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and they did what? They wept bitterly. They're just like, what did we do? And they said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel? And today there should be no one tribe lacking in Israel." And the next day the people rose early and built there an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the people of Israel said, "Which of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly of the Lord? For they have taken a great oath concerning him who did come up to the Lord at Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. In other words, all right, who didn't come up? We need to take care of that. And the people of Israel had compassion for who? For Benjamin, their brother, and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel this day. Now they recognized, all right, wow, okay. They're not going to repopulate very quickly unless they have additional women and wives and things like that. It doesn't in other words, it doesn't happen unless you got a man and a woman. There's only 600 of them left. What shall we do, verse 7, for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them away any of our daughters for wives. So they're thinking, all right, what do we do? What do we do? We made a vow before God. What do we do? What do we do? Well, what you're getting ready to see is just really weird. And it is a compromise. Let's call it a loophole. All right. Which they were very, very good at doing. All right. So we see.
Into the cities, they kill women too. It doesn't say that. Not like in past where they slaughtered everything.
And the animals.
Yeah, it just doesn't give those details, but all we know is there's 600 left. All right. Verses 8 through 12, the expedition of Israel against Jabash Gilead. Let's look here in verses 8 through 12. It says, and they said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel that did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah? And behold, no one had come to the camp from Jabash Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabash Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men there and commanded them, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabash Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. All right. So in other words, this is, remember, that one oath says if there's somebody that's not coming with us, we're not going to go home until we've taken care of this. And if somebody doesn't come up with us, we're going to take care of them. And that's what they did. Go and strike the inhabitants. In verse 11, this is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that has lain with the male, you shall devote to destruction, which is what they should have been doing to all the other all the other wicked people in Canaan. All right. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead, notice this, 400 young virgins. You guys know where this is going. All right. Who had not known a man by lying with him, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. So they go up, they destroy all but 400 of these unwed daughters of that city, and these are the females, obviously because they're young virgins who had not laid with a man. And then in verses 13 through 18, we see this reconciliation of Israel with Benjamin. Notice here what they do. So this is the other tribes. These are virgins of the other tribes, not of Benjamin. They said, we're not going to give up our daughters for marriage. So they found these 400, which are of their daughters. Keep that in mind. Verse 13. Then the whole congregation sent word to the people of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon and proclaimed peace to them. And Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women who they had saved alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they were not enough for them. Okay, so notice, here you go, here's 400. But they had compassion on Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Then the elders of the congregation said, what shall we do for the wives of those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin? And they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives for our daughters. Why? They made a vow, for the people of Israel had sworn, cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. And then, so now notice the provision, letter D on your outline, the provision of the maidens from Shiloh, verses 19 through 24. So they said, they got a plan. Behold, there is the yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, which is where they should have been having all that anyway, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and the south of Lebanon. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in ambush in the vineyards. Now follow this narrative. This is just stupid. Verse 21, and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers came to complain to us, we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so and took their wives according to their number from the dancers who they carried off. And then they went and they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. And they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. Now, what did you just notice happen here? We can't give them to wives. We can't give them away. But they can snatch them. In other words, get out there and dance. You have permission. We're not going to give them to you. All right, just snatch them. It would be like going, it's like, okay, I'm not allowed to give you that 60-inch HD TV. I can't do that. It would be wrong. All right. But if you go out there and snatch it, I'm not going to say anything. That's exactly what they did there. So they found a loophole for what they had vowed to do, but it's just bizarre. And it goes to show that how depraved and how low Israel had gotten during that time. A very, very, very dark time in their history. In verse 25, number 4 on your outline, the characteristics of the period of the judges, this wraps it all up. In those days, there was no king in Israel. What does that last sentence say? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up the book of Judges. So I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you got a lot of gleanings from this. I can't believe I did 3 chapters. I know I could see the shock on your face too. But I shared with you where I thought the Lord was leading me. As I continued to pray, I was gonna do the book of Jude. I think we'll still do that at some point. I will probably make the book of Jude more of a message as opposed to kind of a verse by verse study, because it's a very short book. It's just, there's no chapter and it's just Jude. We're going to do 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. All right. So I think we'll all really, really enjoy it. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John is so rich. Of course, it all is rich. So be in prayer for me as I start to gather us and study for our next Wednesday night study in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. There is a lot there. So folks online, you beautiful people, anybody have any closing thoughts or anything tonight before we close out in prayer? How about you, Elmo? No? All right. Well, I love you all very, very much. Please, please, please come out to the missions conference. Please, please, please be in prayer. Saturday, if you don't come out for anything else, come out for the food, right? And bring food. We need you to sign up. Sign up what country. I don't care if you want to go to Taco Bell, whatever. But we're going to have a good time. We'll have a good time with our missionaries that'll be here and so forth. So any other closing thoughts? All right. Well, thank you guys for your faithfulness. Brad, would you close us in prayer tonight, brother?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you so much for your word and your truth. You're just never changing. Fatherhood. Lord, just be with Pastor Dwayne this next week as he studies for new lesson first. Be with us all. Help us to find some people that don't know you.
Amen. Thank you so much, brother. God bless you guys. I love you. And we will see you next week, Lord willing, unless the rapture happens.